In the late 1920s, the world economy hums with an uneasy energy, a lattice of trade finance and production stretching across oceans. In the United States, industrial output reaches new heights, farms produce surpluses that flood domestic and foreign markets, and cities pulse with speculative optimism. Yet beneath the surface, structural imbalances accumulate. Banks lend with growing risk, brokers extend credit for stock purchases far beyond actual deposits, and governments maintain a fragile gold standard that links currencies rigidly across continents. Financial historians note that by 1928, U.S. stock market capitalization is more than double the nation's industrial output, a numerical tension that quietly signals systemic vulnerability. This tension is not confined to America. European economies still recovering from the devastation of the First World War rely heavily on U.S. loans and investment to stabilize reconstruction, creating a chain of dependence that spans the Atlantic. Japan and parts of Latin America engage in similar credit-driven growth, often pegged to exports of raw materials and agricultural goods. These interconnections render the global economy a delicate lattice. A failure in one node has the potential to transmit stress far beyond its origin. Less commonly noted is the depth of urban-rural disparity within nations themselves. In the American Midwest, for instance, farms expand production in response to wartime demand, yet local prices decline steadily, leaving landowners and tenants increasingly leveraged. Bank loans secured against land and equipment grow larger even as the underlying value of commodities fluctuates unpredictably. Small towns reliant on a single industry, such as coal or textiles, begin to show signs of strain, though national statistics mask these vulnerabilities. Historians also point to an unresolved question: the extent to which the rapid proliferation of consumer credit, particularly installment buying for automobiles and appliances, contributed to a latent fragility that would later magnify collapse. Economists debate whether a slower, more measured expansion of credit might have prevented the systemic shock, or if the crisis was inevitable given the global interdependence of finance and trade. On a planetary scale, these economic dynamics intersect with natural cycles of agriculture and resource distribution. Surplus production in the American plains depresses global wheat prices, influencing farming practices as far away as Argentina and Australia, while industrial demand in Europe drives extraction of coal, iron, and copper in Africa and Asia. Rivers and railways built decades earlier serve as conduits for these materials, linking local ecologies to distant markets. The invisible pressures of these interconnected systems, financial, social, and environmental, create an underlying tension that will soon erupt. The patterns of debt accumulation, speculative risk, and uneven wealth distribution set the stage for the first visible cracks in the lattice. By the autumn of 1929, newspaper headlines hint at market volatility, yet daily life in urban centers and farming regions continues with a measured rhythm, unaware of the approaching collapse. This period is also notable for its underreported innovations in risk management and accounting practices, many of which fail to capture the full exposure of institutions to speculative losses. Some banks maintain reserves that appear adequate in national terms, but are vulnerable to regional shocks. The interplay of local and global assessments remains a poorly understood factor. The slow pace of regulatory adaptation, national governments balancing between laissez-faire principles and nascent oversight, allows vulnerabilities to accumulate quietly. Observing from the present one can see the planetary scale of exposure. Economic decisions in Chicago influence employment in Manchester. Investment in New York affects commodity flows to Calcutta, and the fates of small towns in the American Midwest ripple outward through shipping networks and financial contracts. These interwoven systems highlight both human ingenuity and fragility. As the year 1929 closes, there is a subtle shift in perception among investors and policymakers. Some recognize early signs of overextension, while others remain confident that market self-correction will resolve minor instabilities. The fact that the initial cracks are visible only in specialized financial reports or local agricultural markets illustrates the uneven perception of risk. This unevenness contributes to delayed responses and amplifies vulnerability. Contemporary scholars often emphasize the human dimensions of these economic patterns. Farmers facing falling crop prices adapt by intensifying labor, or mortgaging land. Urban workers respond to wage stagnation with household economies and informal labor arrangements, and small manufacturers attempt to diversify output to maintain cash flow. These adaptations are not uniform and often fail to prevent localized hardship, yet they also reveal the resilience and flexibility of communities operating within broader impersonal systems of trade and finance. Less commonly discussed is the role of communications technology in transmitting economic information and sentiment. Telegraph networks, print media, and nascent radio broadcasts carry both data and perception across continents, shaping decisions in ways that modern observers can trace but cannot fully quantify. The interplay between perception and reality, fact and rumor, adds a further layer of complexity to understanding the causes of the forthcoming collapse. At this juncture, the lattice of global finance and trade is a living network, simultaneously robust and brittle. It has supported unprecedented growth, migration, and innovation, yet it contains hidden stresses that threaten to propagate shockwaves worldwide. Rivers of capital flow with regularity, yet their channels are narrow and constrained, sensitive to sudden withdrawals or market panic. From the vantage of later decades, it becomes apparent that the late 1920s mark a unique historical moment, a convergence of technological, financial, and social systems whose interdependence renders local disturbances potentially global in consequence. Within this interdependence lies a planetary observation. Human economic activity increasingly synchronizes with natural cycles, from agricultural harvests to shipping seasons, embedding human vulnerability in environmental rhythms. In quiet towns, markets, and ports, ordinary life continues with routine diligence, unaware of the forces accumulating at planetary scale. The fissures in the lattice are subtle, almost invisible, yet their presence is sufficient to generate cascading consequences. In retrospect, the structural imbalances of this period serve as a reminder of the fragility of human systems and the profound reach of interconnected decisions. Small choices in investment, production, and consumption aggregated across regions and continents create effects that travel vast distances, linking the fates of disparate communities and economies. The stage is set, the lattice is tense, and the quiet energies of the late 1920s converge toward an inevitable disruption, a transformation whose reverberations will be felt across continents and generations. In October 1929, the delicate lattice of global finance begins to unravel with a sudden intensity centered in the United States, but reverberating across continents. On October 24, known later as Black Thursday, trading volumes surge on the New York Stock Exchange as prices falter and panic begins to spread among investors. Brokers call in loans, margins collapse, and the illusion of infinite growth dissolves in the span of hours. Over the following week, the market experiences additional sharp declines, with Black Monday and Black Tuesday marking the most dramatic contractions in financial history to that point. Industrialists, banks, and ordinary investors alike confront losses that in many cases exceed their accumulated wealth, and the concentrated collapse of capital undermines credit systems that previously supported domestic and international trade. While the event is often remembered for its dramatic market figures, less commonly noted is the quiet human dimension of the crash. Employees in brokerage firms face sudden unemployment. Clerks and telegraph operators struggle to process overwhelming volumes of transactions, and rural investors reliant on stock market speculation to supplement declining farm incomes experience devastation that reaches deep into small towns. This juxtaposition of urban financial collapse with rural economic fragility exemplifies the complex interdependence of city and countryside industry and agriculture within the wider economy. Historians continue to examine unresolved questions about the speed and scale of the collapse, particularly the role of psychological contagion versus structural financial weakness. Some argue that human perception and collective anxiety accelerated the market's decline, while others maintain that the underlying credit imbalances and over-leveraging made a collapse inevitable regardless of sentiment. The truth likely resides in the intersection of both factors, as each intensified the other in a feedback loop that spread through brokers' offices, banks, and news reports. Internationally, the shock is immediate and profound. European banks heavily reliant on U.S. capital and interwar loans experience liquidity crises. Germany, struggling to maintain reparations payments, and industrial output faces bank failures and business closures. Britain's financial sector, tied to both European recovery and colonial trade networks, confronts declining confidence and investment. Japan, dependent on export markets and foreign loans, sees industrial stagnation. Latin American nations that export coffee, sugar, and minerals experience sudden price collapses, and rural communities confront falling incomes and increased hardship. Across oceans, the economic lattice transmits stress through commodity prices, loan defaults, and disrupted shipping schedules, revealing the global interconnection of production, finance, and consumption. A lesser-known detail emerges in archival records. Certain banks and firms attempt to mitigate losses by redistributing assets across domestic branches and international subsidiaries, revealing early informal risk management strategies. Though these are largely insufficient to contain the systemic shock, these localized efforts highlight the uneven capacity of institutions to respond to global crises, and they underscore the limits of foresight in a world of complex interdependence. On a planetary scale, the collapse exposes the interlocking nature of human economic activity and resource flows. The sudden contraction in U.S. demand reduces imports of raw materials from South America and Asia, while surplus commodities depress global prices, affecting agricultural systems and labor markets thousands of kilometers from the epicenter. Coastal ports, long hubs of trade, grow quieter as shipping schedules are reduced, while rail networks see diminished freight, subtly altering the rhythms of landscapes and communities that had previously depended on steady flows of goods. The human response to immediate financial disaster is uneven. In urban centers, banks implement withdrawal limits, governments debate intervention, and communities rely on informal support networks. In rural regions, families adjust planting strategies, diversify local economies where possible, or migrate to nearby cities in search of work. These adaptations, while small in isolation, collectively form a visible pattern of resilience amid systemic collapse, revealing the dynamic interplay between local agency and structural constraint. Yet the scale and simultaneity of the financial shock overwhelm most immediate responses. Unemployment spreads, production slows, and the availability of credit contracts reducing the capacity of economies to stabilize naturally. Researchers continue to investigate unresolved mysteries, such as the precise mechanisms by which panic spread through interconnected markets, or how communication technologies telegraphed newspapers and early radio broadcasts amplified or mitigated perception of risk. These questions remain partially open, reflecting the difficulty of quantifying human behavior and sentiment alongside measurable economic variables. As weeks pass, the collapse begins to reshape the temporal and spatial dimensions of economic activity. Production schedules, migration patterns, and consumption behaviors adjust to new realities. Factories reduce shifts, warehouses hold excess inventory, and rural households delay investments in equipment or land improvements. Even small towns once insulated from global finance experience the consequences through bank failures, diminished credit, and reduced demand for local goods. The planetary observation emerges from this recalibration. Human economic networks operate not only through the movement of capital, but also through patterns of perception, adaptation, and anticipation linking distant communities in ways that are both visible in material flows and subtle in behavioral responses. In the immediate aftermath, policy responses are limited and fragmented. The U.S. government, while aware of the scale of the crisis, debates the merits of intervention versus market self-correction. Internationally, countries face similar dilemmas, constrained by gold standards and fiscal orthodoxy, yet pressured to address unemployment, declining production, and social unrest. These constraints underscore the structural interdependence of policy finance and social stability. Less commonly highlighted is the tension between centralized and local responses. Municipal governments and local communities often implement measures that predate national policies, from public works to cooperative relief networks, revealing a layered human response that operates in parallel with larger economic forces. Through this lens, the Great Depression is not simply a financial collapse. It is a planetary-scale disturbance, a redistribution of resources, risk, and human effort across continents, climates, and social strata. Rivers, ports, railways, and urban centers all register the subtle shifts in economic flow, while human populations adjust through labor migration and household strategies. The collapse, though most visible in market indices, is experienced tangibly in landscapes of industry and agriculture alike. By the end of 1929, the lattice of global trade and finance has been visibly stressed, and the stage is set for deeper and more prolonged effects. The fall of Wall Street is not an isolated event, but a catalyst, one node in an interconnected network whose fragility has been exposed. As scholars trace the unfolding months, the planetary perspective becomes clear. Economic collapse travels along the veins of human activity, linking markets, communities, and resources in patterns that are complex, recursive, and globally resonant. Each localized reaction, whether a bank closure in Hamburg, a labor strike in New York, or a crop adjustment in Buenos Aires, feeds into the larger dynamics, illustrating the recursive feedback between human behavior and structural systems. Even as the dust settles on immediate losses, the shockwaves radiate outward, altering perceptions of risk, reshaping institutions, and signaling that the lattice of human economic activity is at once resilient and profoundly vulnerable. Within this quiet tension lies the historical significance of 1929, a moment when invisible vulnerabilities became visible, and when the human and planetary scales of economic interdependence were starkly revealed. The financial collapse of the autumn thus marks not just the fall of markets, but the awakening of awareness to systemic fragility, a recognition that will define responses in the years that follow, shaping migration, adaptation, and policy on scales that extend far beyond the United States. As the financial collapse spreads beyond American borders, its effects are felt with growing intensity across Europe and Asia, where industrial economies, colonial dependencies, and agrarian systems intersect in complex ways. In Germany, the fragile post-war economy, already burdened by reparations and inflationary pressures, confronts a sudden contraction in credit as American loans and investment dry up. Banks fail, industrial production declines, and unemployment rises rapidly, particularly in urban centers such as Berlin and the Ruhr. Smaller communities dependent on single industries or regional trade experience sudden shocks, while rural farmers confront falling agricultural prices as global markets adjust to diminished demand. Less frequently noted is the subtle role of social networks and informal economies during this period. Local cooperatives, barter arrangements, and family-based labor exchanges emerge as temporary stabilizers, allowing survival in the absence of formal financial support. Across the English Channel, Britain experiences similar stresses. Industrial regions in the Midlands and the North, reliant on coal textiles and shipbuilding, see falling orders and wage reductions. The gold standard constrains monetary policy, limiting governmental flexibility to stimulate recovery, while trade with the empire provides only partial insulation. In France, relatively greater agricultural diversity and decentralized banking provide some buffering effect, yet export-dependent industries face reduced foreign demand. The patterns of economic contraction are uneven, creating a mosaic of impact that varies by sector, region, and social strata. In Japan, the decline in demand for silk and other export commodities destabilizes rural economies, particularly in regions engaged in small-scale sericulture, while urban industrial centers adjust by reducing production and laying off workers. Southeast Asian colonies supplying rubber, rice, and tin to global markets experience price collapses that ripple through local economies, affecting wage labor, tenant farming, and regional trade networks. Less commonly highlighted is the role of transportation infrastructure in transmitting economic stress. Ports, railways, and inland waterways designed to facilitate trade instead serve as conduits for the propagation of scarcity and reduce commercial activity. Shipping schedules, contract warehouses fill with unsold goods, and logistical bottlenecks emerge as a tangible consequence of declining demand. On a planetary scale, these disruptions illustrate the integration of human economic systems with ecological and geographic networks. The flow of commodities, grain, metals, textiles, and industrial inputs links distant climates and terrains into a single interdependent lattice, such that reduced activity in one region resonates across oceans and continents. Social adaptation becomes a pressing concern. Urban workers face unemployment and shrinking wages, while families adjust household economies, delay expenditures, and rely on community networks. Migration patterns begin to shift. Displaced workers move towards cities with remaining opportunities. Rural populations seek alternative livelihoods, and some international labor movements accelerate, often informally. These responses, while small in isolation, collectively form observable patterns of human adaptation under stress. Researchers continue to examine unresolved questions about the interplay between global trade contraction, political responses, and social unrest. In some countries, such as Germany and Japan, the economic crisis intersects with pre-existing political instability, influencing electoral behavior and the rise of radical movements, yet the precise causal pathways remain debated among historians and economists. Archaeological and archival evidence also reveals subtler human behaviors during this period. In towns affected by industrial decline, informal markets, craft production, and subsistence gardening increase, creating microeconomies that buffer families against extreme deprivation. These small-scale adaptations are often overlooked in macroeconomic narratives, but illuminate human resilience and ingenuity in the face of systemic disruption. Less widely discussed is the effect of climate and seasonal cycles on the propagation of economic stress. Agricultural production remains tied to rainfall temperature and seasonal schedules, so declines in global demand interact with environmental variability, compounding vulnerability. In some cases, surplus crops go unsold, leading to localized food insecurity despite overall global abundance. At the planetary scale, the crisis reveals the sensitivity of interconnected systems to both human and environmental factors. Market contraction, labor displacement, and transportation slowdowns illustrate how economic networks are embedded in physical landscapes, from river valleys to industrial regions and maritime routes. The human experience is distributed unevenly across these landscapes, yet every region participates in the feedback loops generated by global interdependence. Cultural and social dimensions of adaptation also emerge. In some European countries, community institutions, charities, and mutual aid societies expand their activities supporting displaced workers and impoverished families. In Asia, traditional family and village networks absorb economic shocks, while urban migrants form informal labor arrangements to sustain livelihoods. These adaptations highlight the interaction of social structures with broader economic forces, demonstrating both constraint and agency within systemic collapse. Despite the visible effects, many uncertainties persist. Scholars debate the relative contribution of international trade contraction versus domestic policy missteps to prolonged economic downturns, and the pathways by which unemployment, wage reduction, and social adaptation influence subsequent political change remain incompletely understood. Similarly, the long-term environmental consequences of altered production and consumption patterns, such as shifts in land use or industrial activity, are difficult to quantify but form part of the planetary imprint of the Depression. Observing these patterns collectively, a planetary-scale perspective emerges. Human economic activity functions as a network that extends across continents, climates, and ecological zones, where financial collapse in one node resonates through production, trade, and labor systems worldwide. Rivers, railways, ports, and transportation corridors become the veins through which economic shockwaves propagate, linking otherwise distant human communities. By the early 1930s, the global contraction has solidified into prolonged hardship. Industrial output remains depressed, agricultural prices fluctuate unpredictably, and social stress intensifies in both urban and rural contexts. Migration and local adaptation continue, yet the magnitude of the collapse challenges both human ingenuity and institutional capacity. Governments respond unevenly, constrained by currency standards, fiscal orthodoxy, and political hesitation, while populations adapt through local strategies, labor mobility, and household economies. Less commonly acknowledged is the interconnectedness of these responses. Adaptations in one region, such as delayed planting or alternative employment, can ripple across trade networks, influencing distant economies and production cycles. At this scale, the Great Depression is not merely a historical event, but a planetary phenomenon, a reconfiguration of resource flows, labor patterns, and economic perception across the globe. Communities large and small, urban and rural, industrial and agricultural, participate in a shared experience of contraction, adaptation, and uncertainty. The lattice of human economic activity, once expanding, now experiences pronounced tension, revealing both the fragility and resilience inherent in interconnected systems. In this context, the Depression is a lens through which the complex interplay of finance, trade, labor, and ecology becomes visible. The patterns of contraction and adaptation extend far beyond immediate markets, linking human behavior with geography, climate, and infrastructure. Rivers, ports, railways, and industrial centers serve as markers of the shifting flows of capital, labor, and commodities, while human strategies of adaptation demonstrate both innovation and constraint. The echoes of 1929 and its aftermath resonate not only in markets, but across landscapes and communities worldwide, establishing a foundation for further analysis of survival, migration, and the planetary scope of economic interdependence. The scale of disruption, the subtlety of adaptation, and the persistence of uncertainty together define a period in which humanity's global networks are tested and reconfigured. As the global economy contracts, human communities confront the pressing need to adapt, survive, and reorganize in response to widespread deprivation and uncertainty. In urban centers across Europe, North America, and Asia, unemployment rises rapidly, leaving households to adjust consumption, labor participation, and domestic economies. Families reduce non-essential expenditures, grow small gardens where possible, and turn to informal markets or barter systems to secure basic necessities. Less frequently noted are the micro-level innovations that arise in the face of scarcity. Community kitchens, cooperative purchasing groups, and temporary craft production provide localized support, demonstrating adaptive strategies that often go unrecorded in official statistics. In rural regions, the contraction of international commodity prices leads to direct consequences for agricultural labor, crop selection, and land use. Farmers confronting falling wheat, cotton, or coffee prices adjust planting decisions, diversify livestock, or delay investments in equipment. Some migrate seasonally or permanently to nearby towns or cities, creating temporary labor surges that challenge local resources and infrastructure. These migrations, though modest in absolute numbers, form discernible patterns that reflect the adaptive capacity of human populations under systemic stress. In North America, for instance, the Dust Bowl, while primarily an environmental crisis, intersects with economic collapse, amplifying rural hardship and driving population movement westward. Communities adapt by combining labor migration with small-scale subsistence strategies, yet uncertainty persists, revealing the limits of human agency in the face of simultaneous ecological and economic pressures. Across Asia, Japan's industrial decline prompts urban workers to return to rural regions or seek employment in informal labor sectors, while colonial economies in Southeast Asia and India adjust to declining export demand through reduced production, labor redistribution, and localized market activity. These adaptations illustrate a planetary pattern. Human survival strategies manifest differently depending on geography, climate, and economic structure, yet share common themes of resourcefulness, mobility, and interdependence. Institutional responses occur alongside these human strategies. Governments implement measures ranging from public works programs to limited financial relief, attempting to stabilize employment and sustain social cohesion. The effectiveness of these interventions varies, influenced by fiscal capacity, policy design, and administrative reach. In some regions, municipal authorities and local organizations act preemptively, establishing work relief or cooperative initiatives before national policies take effect. These layered responses highlight the interaction between formal and informal adaptive systems where human agency operates within the constraints imposed by structural collapse. Less commonly recognized are the ripple effects of human adaptation on long-term social and demographic patterns. Migration driven by economic necessity alters urban-rural population distributions, labor availability, and local economies, with consequences that extend beyond the immediate crisis. In some cases, temporary adaptations solidify into permanent changes, influencing occupational structures, settlement patterns, and cultural practices for decades. An unresolved question among historians and economists concerns the extent to which these adaptations accelerated structural transformation in global labor markets and industrial organization. Some evidence suggests that migration and informal labor practices during the Depression facilitated later economic recovery, while other analyses emphasize the social strain and lost productivity associated with displacement and household stress. On a planetary scale, the Great Depression demonstrates the interconnection of human survival with environmental, technological, and infrastructural systems. River transport rail networks and ports continue to mediate the movement of goods and labor, shaping the spatial dynamics of adaptation. Diminished trade volumes alter resource distribution across regions, influencing local economies and subsistence practices. Even in remote areas, communities experience indirect effects through reduced commodity prices, shifts in labor demand, and altered access to manufactured goods. These patterns underscore the extent to which human adaptation is embedded in a planetary system of economic, technological, and environmental interdependence. The crisis also reveals the limitations of human foresight in the face of systemic shocks. Families, communities, and governments act with the information available, yet the scale, simultaneity, and complexity of the Depression constrain effective responses. Short-term adaptations, while essential for survival, often fail to address underlying structural vulnerabilities, leaving populations exposed to subsequent shocks. This tension between immediate coping strategies and long-term resilience highlights the recursive interaction between human behavior and systemic conditions. Less commonly examined are the psychological and cultural dimensions of adaptation. Oral histories, local records, and contemporary accounts document strategies for managing uncertainty, maintaining social cohesion, and preserving essential knowledge. Practices such as informal lending, cooperative childcare, or shared agricultural labor reflect collective adaptations that, while subtle, contribute to community resilience. At the same time, these responses underscore the dependence of human survival on social networks, trust, and local knowledge, revealing the social fabric as both buffer and conduit for coping under extreme economic pressure. The planetary scale perspective becomes evident in the redistribution of populations' labor and resources across continents. Seasonal or permanent migration reshapes urban and rural demographics, labor networks, and consumption patterns. Reduced demand for commodities in one region transmits scarcity to distant suppliers, influencing decisions on land use, production, and labor allocation. These dynamics highlight the extent to which human societies operate within interconnected systems whose boundaries extend well beyond local geography. In addition, the Depression catalyzes long-term technological and institutional adaptations. Communities invest in small-scale mechanization, cooperative production, and local infrastructure to buffer against future shocks, while governments and international organizations begin to consider policies for stabilizing credit, employment, and trade. Though modest in scope initially, these innovations lay the groundwork for systemic reforms in the subsequent decades. Unresolved questions remain about the balance between local ingenuity and centralized intervention in shaping adaptive outcomes. Scholars continue to investigate how micro-level strategies interact with macroeconomic policies to produce varying trajectories of resilience and recovery. By observing these patterns collectively, a planetary-scale view emerges. Human adaptation during the Depression is neither uniform nor isolated, but an emergent property of interdependent systems that link communities, economies, and environments. The crisis reveals both the fragility of human systems under stress and the capacity for improvisation, migration, and social innovation. Rivers transport corridors, ports, and industrial hubs all mediate these processes, demonstrating how geography, infrastructure, and human behavior intersect to shape survival outcomes. In the quiet labor of small towns, the reorganization of households, the cultivation of gardens, and the adjustment of local economies, one observes a microcosm of planetary adaptation where human ingenuity and environmental context coalesce in response to systemic collapse. Through these adaptations, communities navigate scarcity and uncertainty, preserving essential lifeways while responding to constraints imposed by distant markets, policy limitations, and environmental variability. The Depression in this light becomes not only an economic event, but a lens for understanding the interplay of human resilience, social networks, and planetary-scale interconnection. These patterns of survival and adaptation, subtle yet persistent, trace the pathways through which human populations navigate systemic risk, offering insights into both historical processes and enduring principles of interconnected human ecology. By the mid-1930s, the global depression has left enduring marks on human society, economic policy, and international relations, reshaping patterns of trade, migration, and institutional practice across continents. In the United States, New Deal programs and financial reforms introduce measures aimed at stabilizing banking, providing employment, and regulating industry, creating new frameworks for economic governance. European nations experiment with policy interventions of varying scope and design, while some maintain fiscal orthodoxy constrained by gold standards and debt obligations limiting their ability to respond effectively. Japan and other industrializing nations implement targeted industrial policies to protect domestic production, often privileging strategic industries and urban centers, while rural populations continue to adapt through small-scale agriculture, informal labor, and migration to industrial hubs. The Depression also accelerates structural transformations within labor markets. Urban unemployment, prolonged wage suppression, and migration create a reconfiguration of workforce distribution, leading to both temporary and long-term shifts in occupational patterns. Less commonly noted is the influence of informal labor networks, cooperative enterprises, and localized barter systems, which continue to sustain households and communities even as formal institutions struggle to restore stability. These adaptations illustrate the interplay between systemic shocks and human ingenuity, revealing the capacity for decentralized response within tightly interconnected economies. Internationally, the Depression leaves legacies in trade policy and diplomatic relations. Nations confront the limits of open markets, experiment with tariffs and protectionist measures, and navigate shifting patterns of colonial and international commerce. Exports of raw materials, agricultural products, and manufactured goods fluctuate in response to both demand and policy, influencing local economies and labor markets thousands of kilometers from consumption centers. Less examined is the uneven impact of these policies within individual countries. Regions reliant on particular commodities or industries experience persistent distress, while others adapt more successfully through diversification or proximity to emerging centers of demand. On a planetary scale, the Depression illustrates the vulnerability of human systems to synchronized shocks. Economic contraction propagates along trade routes, financial networks, and communication channels, linking distant communities in patterns of cause and effect that extend across oceans and continents. Rivers, railways, and ports continue to function as conduits for both goods and economic stress, highlighting the integration of infrastructure, environment, and human behavior. The redistribution of labor resources and production in response to systemic collapse exemplifies how local decisions interact with global networks, producing outcomes that are often unanticipated and emergent. Human migration patterns, both temporary and permanent, reflect these dynamics. Workers displaced by industrial decline move to regions with remaining employment opportunities, agricultural laborers adjust to market fluctuations, and international migration shifts subtly in response to changing demand. These movements, while uneven and constrained, form discernible patterns that influence demographic distributions, urban growth, and regional economies for decades. An unresolved question remains regarding the extent to which these migration flows shaped post-depression economic recovery and social structures, particularly in regions that later experienced rapid industrial expansion. In cultural and social terms, the Depression leaves enduring imprints on collective behavior, community organization, and institutional development. Communities rely on cooperative arrangements, informal lending networks, and mutual aid to mitigate hardship, reinforcing social cohesion even as economic stress intensifies. These adaptive practices, while often invisible in macroeconomic analysis, reveal the persistence of human ingenuity and the role of local knowledge in navigating systemic shocks. Governments and international organizations, learning from these patterns, gradually incorporate social safety measures, public works programs, and employment policies into longer-term governance structures. Less frequently highlighted is the interplay between these institutional adaptations and individual or community-level strategies, illustrating the multi-layered nature of resilience in a complex, interconnected system. Planetary scale observations emerge from this period as well. The Depression demonstrates how human economic systems are embedded in environmental and infrastructural networks. Fluctuations in demand influence agricultural production, resource extraction, and transport logistics across continents. Reduced trade volumes alter the flow of commodities, impacting both ecological systems and human labor patterns. Urban centers, ports, and industrial corridors become loci for adaptation and reorganization, while rural regions adjust production labor allocation and migration in response to changing global conditions. The crisis, therefore, is both a human and planetary event, revealing the intricate connections between local action and systemic outcome. By the late 1930s, the legacies of the Depression are evident not only in policy and economy, but in collective memory and social expectation. Populations have adapted to uncertainty, learned to anticipate fluctuations in employment and commodity availability, and developed strategies for survival that integrate household economies, community networks, and regional labor mobility. These practices persist, shaping behavior and policy well into the post-war era. Less commonly noted is the subtle influence on cultural production, literature, art, and oral histories. From this period, document both hardship and adaptation, preserving knowledge of strategies and experiences that formal records may overlook. The planetary perspective remains crucial for understanding these patterns. Human systems, from financial networks to agricultural production, operate across spatial and temporal scales, linking local decisions to global outcomes. Migration, resource allocation, and labor redistribution all exemplify this interconnectedness, illustrating how human resilience and vulnerability are distributed unevenly but resonate across continents. The Great Depression, in this sense, is not merely a historical episode, but a lens for examining systemic interdependence, adaptation, and the interplay of human and environmental processes. Its consequences are observed in altered trade networks, restructured labor markets, and institutional reforms that continue to influence governance, economic planning, and social policy. From a contemporary perspective, the Depression offers insight into the limits of prediction, the dynamics of human adaptation, and the ways in which local and global systems interact under stress. In the quiet labor of small towns, the reorganized practices of households, and the strategic responses of communities, one sees both the fragility and resilience of human systems operating within planetary scale networks. These patterns reveal the enduring significance of adaptive strategies, both formal and informal, in mitigating systemic shocks and shaping future trajectories of society, economy, and governance. As historians and scholars examine the aftermath, it becomes clear that the legacies of the Depression extend far beyond immediate financial collapse. They persist in the architecture of institutions, the distribution of populations, and the cultural memory of communities, providing a record of both vulnerability and ingenuity. In this sense, the Depression is both a moment and a process, a convergence of human behavior, environmental context, and systemic interconnection that illuminates the capacities and constraints of societies under duress. The planetary scale reverberations observed through migration, trade, and institutional reform underscore the global nature of the crisis and its enduring lessons for understanding interconnected human systems. The Great Depression in its totality leaves a record of economic, social, and environmental transformation, one that continues to inform our understanding of resilience, adaptation, and the complex networks linking human communities across the globe. By the late 1930s, as the immediate shock of economic collapse begins to stabilize, the human world remains marked by adjustment, institutional reform, and subtle realignments of social and labor networks. In industrial cities across the United States, workers gradually return to employment through New Deal public works projects, while small urban businesses resume limited operations, cautiously testing markets previously decimated by collapse. Streets once crowded with unemployed figures begin to see a measured rhythm of labor and domestic activity, though many households continue to rely on subsistence strategies, home gardens, and informal exchange networks to supplement diminished incomes. Across Europe, Germany and Italy observe slow but uneven recovery. Factories reopen in industrial districts, yet employment remains volatile, and rural populations adapt by shifting crop patterns or diversifying labor, often seasonally migrating to nearby towns or cities to secure work. Less frequently noted are the local innovations emerging within communities, cooperative lending circles, collective tool-sharing arrangements, and mutual aid groups that allow families to navigate scarcity while sustaining social cohesion. These practices, while small in scale, contribute to an intricate web of human adaptation that interacts with formal policies and industrial rhythms. In Japan, industrial centers respond to renewed domestic demand, yet rural families continue to navigate constrained opportunities, balancing agricultural production with artisanal work and informal local trade. Southeast Asian colonies adjust to fluctuating global demand for raw materials, while local communities create microeconomies through bartercraft production and collaborative labor, illustrating the persistent interplay between human agency and structural constraint. On a planetary scale, the interdependence of human systems becomes increasingly evident. Fluctuating demand, re-emerging industrial production, and migration patterns link distant regions in subtle feedback loops. Reduced commodity exports in one area affect labor availability in another, while internal migration and urban employment shifts alter the flows of goods, labor, and household consumption. Rivers, ports, and rail networks, often idle during the peak of the Depression, gradually resume their role as conduits for economic activity, subtly reshaping both landscapes and human rhythms. Unresolved questions remain regarding the long-term effects of these adaptations. Scholars continue to study how localized social innovations, from informal labor arrangements to subsistence strategies, influence subsequent institutional reforms and post-war economic stability. Similarly, the uneven recovery of industrial versus rural regions highlights persistent structural vulnerabilities, emphasizing the interplay between geography, infrastructure, and human decision-making. Less commonly observed are the subtle environmental consequences of renewed human activity. Agricultural intensification, shifting land use, and the resumption of industrial extraction leave measurable marks on local ecosystems even as societies strive to rebuild. The slow resumption of economic networks illustrates the ongoing integration of human behavior with planetary systems. In North America, small towns once deeply affected by rural poverty or industrial decline slowly reconnect with regional markets. Families that had migrated to urban centers return to rural homes, bringing new knowledge, skills, and social connections, while local cooperatives and informal networks persist as buffers against potential instability. In Europe, displaced populations continue to circulate seasonally, reflecting both labor needs and the constraints of limited employment opportunities. Children and youth participate in household labor education and community work, maintaining continuity of social knowledge and practical skills. In Asia, similar patterns of adaptation emerge as families balance work in both urban industries and rural agriculture, contributing to complex cycles of migration, labor, and resource use. These dynamics illustrate a recurring theme: human resilience operates across multiple scales simultaneously, from household strategies to regional labor redistribution, each linked to broader economic and environmental systems. The period also witnesses the gradual maturation of institutional responses. Governments and emerging international organizations formalize policies for social welfare, credit stabilization, and infrastructure development informed by the lessons of prior years. Public works employment programs and financial regulations are implemented with an awareness of systemic vulnerability, though implementation varies in efficacy and scope. Less frequently noted is the interaction between formal policies and community-level adaptations. Local knowledge, cooperative networks, and household ingenuity often supplement or mediate the effects of national initiatives, shaping the lived experience of recovery. On a planetary scale, these processes demonstrate the interconnectedness of human and environmental systems. Fluctuations in industrial output, labor, migration, and commodity trade influence distant regions, while local decisions regarding production, consumption, and resource use reverberate across networks of interdependence. Rivers, ports, railways, and roadways function as veins connecting human activity across continents, transmitting both opportunity and constraint. Social, economic, and environmental rhythms converge, emphasizing the scale at which adaptation and resilience operate. Observing the period collectively, a complex portrait of human society emerges, one defined not only by recovery from acute crisis, but also by the subtle reorganization of labor, household economies, social networks, and institutional frameworks. Families navigate the ongoing tension between vulnerability and agency, often employing practices that balance immediate survival with the maintenance of knowledge, social cohesion, and long-term adaptability. Communities, in turn, coordinate labor, resources, and support across multiple generations, embedding cultural and practical knowledge into daily routines. These interwoven strategies form a lattice of resilience that extends from local households to planetary networks of trade, finance, and labor. Unresolved mysteries persist regarding the precise mechanisms by which informal networks, household adaptations, and policy interventions collectively shape long-term recovery trajectories. Some scholars argue that localized ingenuity was a critical driver of resilience, while others emphasize the centrality of institutional reforms in stabilizing global systems. Both perspectives underscore the multiscalar nature of adaptation, where household community, regional, and international processes intersect continuously. By the end of the decade, the human world bears evidence of transformation wrought by years of systemic stress. Urban and rural populations have adapted through migration, labor adjustment, and social innovation. Institutions have evolved in response to crisis, codifying lessons in economic governance, social welfare, and labor policy. Across continents, trade networks and infrastructure reflect both recovery and the latent vulnerabilities that remain in interconnected systems. From the perspective of planetary observation, the period demonstrates the coupling of human behavior, environmental rhythms, and systemic interdependence. Rivers, ports, railways, urban centers, and rural landscapes all register subtle shifts connecting local adaptation to global processes. In this context, the late 1930s emerge as a moment of quiet stabilization where human societies operate with heightened awareness of systemic fragility, applying lessons learned through direct experience of collapse adaptation and gradual recovery. As the world approaches the onset of the 1940s, the transformations set in motion by the Depression continue to influence human behavior, labor organization, and global economic structures. In North America, industrial cities show measured growth, though the scars of the previous decade remain visible in neighborhoods where unemployment had been high and commercial activity had declined. Families that had relied on subsistence gardens, informal markets, and cooperative labor maintain these practices as precautionary measures, integrating them into post-Depression household routines. Children and adolescents participate in domestic labor alongside schooling, learning skills of resourcefulness and self-sufficiency that shape generational knowledge. In Europe, patterns of adaptation are layered with social and political tension. Urban centers slowly resume industrial production, while rural communities maintain diversified agricultural and artisanal activities. Migration continues both seasonally and permanently as families follow labor opportunities or respond to environmental constraints. Less commonly noted are the subtle cultural shifts that accompany these movements: culinary adaptations, local craft innovations, and informal education networks emerge, reflecting both resilience and continuity. In Germany and Italy, the recovery of urban factories is accompanied by increased centralization of economic control, where state intervention shapes labor, allocation, industrial production, and distribution of resources. Yet even within these systems, informal networks of support, family, labor, community cooperatives, barter remain essential to household survival, revealing the enduring role of localized adaptation in mediating structural constraints. Across Asia, Japan's industrial hubs expand, though rural families continue to navigate a balance of agricultural production and small-scale urban labor. In Southeast Asian colonies, fluctuations in global demand persist, and local communities rely on informal markets, cooperative labor, and rotational work to maintain subsistence. The interplay of local adaptation with regional and global economic forces underscores the persistence of multi-scalar human resilience. On a planetary scale, the late 1930s illustrate the interconnectedness of human systems in subtle yet profound ways. The resumption of trade, employment, and industrial production links distant regions, while migration patterns, commodity flows, and labor allocation transmit effects across continents. Rivers, railways, ports, and roads function as veins of economic activity, mediating both opportunity and constraint and reflecting the continuing interplay of human decision-making and environmental circumstance. Within cities, families adjust daily routines to accommodate changing employment and consumption patterns. Household economies blend formal wage labor with informal production, home gardening, and small-scale trade. Children assist in domestic work or local craft. Adults balance labor in multiple sectors, and communities coordinate resource sharing and knowledge transfer. Less frequently highlighted is the psychological dimension of this adaptation. Communities navigate uncertainty, sustaining cohesion and continuity through tacit agreements, shared labor, and collective observation of market and environmental conditions. In rural regions, adaptation takes a different form. Families diversify crops, and livestock engage in rotational labor arrangements and maintain cooperative networks for irrigation harvesting and tool maintenance. Seasonal migration continues to smooth labor shortages, while informal education networks transmit practical skills, local knowledge, and cultural memory across generations. These strategies illustrate the interdependence of social, economic, and ecological systems at multiple scales. Institutional evolution accompanies these human adaptations. Governments implement measures to stabilize employment, regulate industrial production, and formalize social safety nets. Public works programs, employment offices, and cooperative initiatives extend support, often interacting with existing local networks to enhance resilience. The interplay of policy and localized adaptation reveals the layered complexity of recovery, where household strategies, community coordination, and institutional intervention converge to stabilize systems at regional and planetary scales. Unresolved questions persist concerning the long-term effects of these adaptations on demographic patterns, labor distribution, and economic structures. Scholars continue to examine how the combination of household resilience, community networks, and formal policy influence trajectories of post-depression recovery, and how these processes affected generational skill transmission and social cohesion. Across continents, the recovery period demonstrates both the fragility and flexibility of human systems. Social networks mediate the effects of structural constraints, while labor resource allocation and migration patterns reflect adaptive strategies operating within broader ecological and economic contexts. Environmental rhythms, seasonal rainfall, crop cycles, and resource availability remain intertwined with human labor and subsistence, highlighting the planetary scale of interconnectedness. Less commonly noted are the micro-observations of everyday life: children learning domestic or agricultural skills, adults negotiating small-scale trade, and neighbors coordinating labor quietly to sustain households. These acts, while subtle, collectively contribute to systemic resilience and continuity. By the end of the decade, the human world presents a landscape of cautious optimism tempered by historical memory. Urban and rural populations operate within systems made simultaneously more visible and more comprehensible by the lessons of the previous decade. Migration, labor allocation, household economies, and social networks form intricate lattices connecting households, communities, regions, and continents. The recovery of trade, industrial production, and infrastructure reveals the ongoing importance of human decision-making within environmental and economic constraints. Planetary-scale observations emerge from this period as well. Shifts in industrial output, migration flows, and agricultural production in one region influence distant locales, demonstrating the extent of global interconnection. Rivers, ports, railways, and roads continue to mediate these patterns, linking human behavior to environmental and technological systems. Within these networks, resilience manifests through adaptation at multiple levels: household strategies, community coordination, regional labor, redistribution, and institutional policy. These layers interact continuously, shaping both immediate recovery and longer-term structural change. In this context, The late 1930s illustrate a quiet but profound recalibration of human society. Societies retain the lessons of vulnerability while embedding practices of adaptation and foresight into daily routines. Families, communities, and institutions coordinate across scales, balancing local knowledge, environmental conditions, and global economic flows. Migration, labor allocation, and informal networks continue to link distant regions, creating a planetary lattice of human activity. In quiet streets, factories, and rural fields, the rhythms of adaptation, cooperation, and survival reflect the cumulative experience of the previous decade, underscoring both fragility and ingenuity. As historians examine this period, they observe the persistent influence of household economies, community networks, and institutional reforms in shaping patterns of labor migration and resource distribution. The late 1930s therefore stand as a testament to the enduring capacities of human societies to reorganize, adapt, and maintain continuity amid ongoing uncertainty, highlighting the interdependence of local action and planetary systems. Entering the 1940s, the world of human societies reflects a landscape profoundly altered by a decade of economic shock adaptation and incremental recovery, even as new geopolitical tensions begin to emerge. In urban centers of the United States, industries operate at renewed capacity, yet families retain the habits and strategies developed during the Depression. Household gardens supplement store-bought food, children assist in domestic labor, and informal sharing networks persist among neighbors. The rhythm of daily life carries a cautious awareness of vulnerability as communities continue to navigate the lingering uncertainty of global markets and employment stability. Across Europe, cities and towns demonstrate the layered consequences of earlier collapse. Factories in Germany, Italy, and France have resumed production, but labor remains unevenly distributed with seasonal and migratory movements smoothing employment gaps. Rural populations maintain diversified agricultural practices, combining crop rotation, artisanal production, and barter to stabilize livelihoods. Less frequently highlighted are the cultural adaptations that accompany these economic adjustments. Local educational networks, shared childcare arrangements, and craft exchanges preserve both skill and social cohesion across communities. In Asia, Japan's urban centers see expansion of industrial activity, while rural households maintain intricate balances between agricultural production and supplemental labor. Southeast Asian colonies, still integrated into global commodity networks, respond to shifting demand by adjusting crop yields, labor allocation, and local trade practices. These patterns illustrate the enduring interdependence of human systems at regional and planetary scales. Institutional evolution continues to shape the landscape. Governments in North America and Europe implement more structured social safety measures ranging from employment programs to regulatory frameworks intended to stabilize industrial and financial sectors. The interaction between formal policy and informal networks remains critical. Household strategies, community labor sharing, and cooperative initiatives persist as essential complements to official programs, highlighting the multiscalar nature of resilience. Unresolved questions linger regarding the long-term impacts of these adaptive practices. Historians and economists explore how localized household ingenuity, community networks, and institutional reforms together influence the post-Depression trajectory of labor migration and economic stability, and to what extent these patterns inform responses to the subsequent global conflict. On a planetary scale, the human world remains tightly interwoven. Fluctuations in industrial production, migration, and agricultural output in one region influence distant locales through trade labor, demand, and communication networks. Rivers, ports, railways, and roadways serve as veins transmitting both opportunity and constraint, linking local adaptation to global systems. Within urban and rural landscapes, daily life continues to reflect the lessons of the previous decade. Resourcefulness, cooperation, and measured adaptation are woven into the routines of labor schooling and household management. Children and youth participate actively in domestic and agricultural work, learning practical skills and tacit knowledge necessary for long-term survival, while adults navigate formal and informal labor networks to balance income production and household needs. Less commonly observed are the nuanced psychological effects of prolonged uncertainty. Communities develop informal strategies to manage risk, maintain social cohesion, and anticipate fluctuations in labor and resources. In North American cities, families manage small gardens, home-based trades, and collaborative childcare while simultaneously participating in urban industrial labor. Rural communities integrate seasonal migration, crop diversification, and cooperative work, creating a flexible lattice of survival strategies that link households to broader regional and planetary networks. European rural and urban populations similarly coordinate, labor manage household economies, and maintain cooperative practices that buffer against systemic shocks. These adaptations illustrate the intricate layering of human response, where household strategies, community collaboration, and institutional interventions intersect continuously. In Asia, labor redistribution, crop management, and trade practices reflect the same patterns of multiscalar adaptation, emphasizing the continuity of human resilience across continents. The planetary scale observation of this period emerges in the subtle but persistent connections between human activity and environmental, infrastructural, and economic systems. Shifts in employment, industrial output, and agricultural production propagate along rivers, ports, railways, and trade routes, linking regions separated by distance but bound through interdependence. Human adaptation, migration, and labor coordination operate within these networks, illustrating both the fragility and flexibility of planetary systems shaped by human action. By the early 1940s, the world exhibits both continuity and transformation. Societies have internalized the lessons of vulnerability, embedding strategies of adaptation and foresight into daily routines. Migration patterns, labor allocation, household economies, and cooperative networks link local communities to global systems of trade and production. Industrial, rural, and urban landscapes display subtle signs of resilience where human agency intersects with environmental and economic constraints to shape ongoing recovery. Less frequently noted are the persistent everyday practices that sustain these systems. Children learning domestic and agricultural skills, adults negotiating informal labor and trade, and neighbors sharing resources quietly to maintain community stability. These acts, repeated across households and communities, collectively reinforce the structural and social frameworks that support broader adaptation. In this context, the early 1940s represent a moment of cautious stabilization. Human societies, having endured systemic collapse and prolonged hardship, navigate the delicate balance between vulnerability and resilience, embedding lessons learned into institutional, communal, and domestic life. The planetary lattice of economic, social, and environmental interconnection becomes increasingly evident as migration labor flows and commodity distribution transmit both opportunity and constraint across continents. Daily rhythms of work, household management, and community cooperation reflect the ongoing integration of human decision-making with planetary-scale systems. Observed collectively, the early 1940s highlight the cumulative impact of the Great Depression and its aftermath. Societies shaped by scarcity adaptation and institutional evolution, yet continuing to operate within interconnected global networks. Families, Communities and institutions coordinate across scales balancing local knowledge, environmental conditions, and global economic flows. Migration labor allocation and informal networks link distant regions, creating a planetary lattice of human activity. Streets, factories, ports, and rural fields all reflect the quiet work of adaptation, cooperation, and survival, demonstrating both the fragility and ingenuity of human systems. Within these patterns, the legacy of the Depression persists not only in economic and institutional frameworks, but in social memory daily practices and the subtle rhythms of labor migration and community cohesion.